There are thresholds in your life that are not marked by doorways or gates, but by a shift in the air, a change in the quality of silence. They are the moments that cleave time into a distinct before and an unknowable after. For me, that threshold was the sound of my bedroom door, which I had left intentionally ajar, whispering open in the dead of night. It was the soft weight of a body, familiar as my own shadow, depressing the mattress beside me. He was supposed to be on the couch. We had established this, a silent, flimsy agreement made of cushions and a spare blanket. The couch was the designated territory for a friendship that had begun to feel too small to contain whatever was growing between us. It was the buffer zone, the demilitarized strip of land separating the country of what we were from the vast, terrifying continent of what we could be. And he had just crossed it, without a word, without permission, as if drawn by a tide only he could feel. He slid under the covers, his back to me, and the space he occupied radiated a heat that seemed to seep directly into my bones. Every nerve ending in my body went on high alert. A silent city suddenly lit up in the darkness. I lay there, rigid, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. I did not move. I did not speak. I became a statue carved from fear and a desperate, aching hope. My mind, a frantic cartographer, began mapping the new geography of my bed. The inches between his shoulder blades and my chest were a chasm, a canyon of unspoken questions. The quiet rhythm of his breathing was the only sound in the universe, a metronome counting down to either salvation or ruin. This was it. This was the moment the tectonic plates of our friendship finally gave way. I could feel the tremor of it in the mattress, in the frantic pulse hammering against my ribs. He was here, in my bed, and I had no idea if he was running from something or, dare I even think it, running towards me. The silence was a crucible, and I was terrified of what would emerge when it finally broke. To understand the weight of that moment, the sheer, paralyzing gravity of his presence in my bed, you would have to understand the architecture of our friendship. Alex and I were built on a foundation of easy camaraderie and unspoken rules established years ago in the bright, chaotic din of college. I was the quiet one, the observer, perpetually behind the lens of a camera, cataloging the world from a safe distance. My camera was both my shield and my window, allowing me to be present but not entirely participatory. I was the team photographer for the university swim team, a position that suited my temperament perfectly. I could live in the world of reflected light, capturing the explosive power of a dive, the strain of a muscle, the glint of victory in an eye, all without having to break the surface of the water myself. And Alex, he was the water. He was the star freestyle swimmer, a golden boy carved from sunlight and chlorine. He moved with an uncomplicated grace, a physical confidence that I could only dream of. He was all bright energy and easy smiles, the kind of person who collected friends like most people collected loose change, effortlessly and without notice. On the pool deck, he was a god in miniature, his body a perfect instrument of power and speed. Through my lens, I studied him with an artist's intensity that bled, far too quickly, into something deeper, something more akin to worship. I captured the arc of his back as he launched from the starting block, the spray of water like a halo around his head, the exhaustion and triumph that warred on his face when he touched the wall. I had thousands of photographs of him, a secret history of my affection stored on hard drives and in neatly labeled folders. Each image was a silent confession, a testament to the way I saw him, not just as the athlete, but as the boy who would laugh so hard he'd snort, the student who chewed on his pen caps during lectures, the friend who would always, without fail, save you a seat. Our friendship solidified away from the pool, in the hushed quiet of the library and the comfortable clutter of our shared off-campus house. We were an unlikely pairing, the boisterous athlete and the pensive artist, but we fit together in a way that defied logic. He drew me out of my shell, and I, in turn, provided a quiet space for him to land when the pressures of his world became too much. He never seemed to notice the way my gaze lingered, or the way my breath would catch when he'd sling an arm around my shoulders in a casual gesture of affection. To him, I was Leo, his steadfast, reliable friend, his anchor, and I was content with that role, or so I told myself. It was safer to be the harbor than to be the ship, risking the unpredictable storms of a declared love. The fear of shattering the perfect, fragile piece of our friendship was a powerful deterrent. So I kept my feelings locked away, in a room deep inside myself, and I never, ever left the door ajar. After graduation, our lives diverged as expected. Alex, his competitive swimming career behind him, poured his relentless energy into the world of software consulting. It was a life of airports and client meetings, of sharp suits and corporate jargon that I could barely comprehend. He moved through this world with the same apparent ease he had moved through the water, but I could see the subtle changes in him during his increasingly infrequent visits. There was a new tension in his shoulders, a weariness behind his smile that my camera could no longer capture, because he was rarely still enough for a portrait. He was dating a series of bright, successful women, each one a perfect match on paper, but none of whom seemed to last. He'd talk about them with a kind of detached affection, as if he were describing characters in a book he was reading. There was always a barrier, a pane of glass between him and the rest of the world that he seemed unable or unwilling to break. My life, by contrast, had remained quiet and rooted. I built a modest career as a freelance photographer, specializing in portraits and quiet, intimate landscapes. My apartment was my sanctuary, a small, light-filled space that smelled of darkroom chemicals and old books. It was a reflection of me, ordered, calm, and self-contained. It was the one place where I felt completely in control, where the chaos of the outside world couldn't touch me. It was also the place Alex always came back to. He would call me from a sterile hotel room in a city whose name he'd forget by the next week, and his voice would be frayed at the edges. He'd talk about closing a deal or a difficult client, but what I heard was the profound loneliness humming beneath the surface of his words. He was an island, and his life was an archipelago of temporary connections. My apartment, and by extension, me, was his only mainland. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, grinding pressure that had been building for years. It began with a phone call on a Tuesday night. I was editing a set of photos, lost in the familiar dance of adjusting light and shadow, when my phone buzzed with his name. I answered, expecting to hear the usual story of a delayed flight or a successful presentation. Instead, all I heard was a choked, ragged breath. "Leo," he said, and his voice was so small, so broken, that for a terrifying second I didn't recognize it. "Alex? What's wrong? Where are you?" "It's over," he whispered, and the words were hollowed out, devoid of all their usual confidence. "Sarah and I. It's over." Sarah had been the most serious of them all. They had been together for nearly 2 years, had talked about moving in together, about a future. From my distant vantage point, she had seemed like the one who might finally anchor him. I mumbled something inadequate, some platitude about being sorry, my mind racing. Can I come over?" he asked, his voice cracking on the last word. "I don't want to be at my place." It's too quiet, of course," I said, my heart constricting. "Come now." "I'll wait up." When he arrived an hour later, he looked like a shipwreck. His suit was rumpled, his tie was loosened, and his eyes, normally so bright and alive, were dull and shadowed. He didn't say anything as he stepped inside. He just walked to the center of my living room and stood there, looking lost and out of place, a stranger in the most familiar room in the world. I had never seen him so undone. Alex was the sun, always burning, always bright. Seeing him like this, extinguished and cold, felt fundamentally wrong, like a law of nature had been violated. He carried with him the heavy silence of an empty apartment, the ghost of a shared life now haunting a space meant for two. He sank onto my couch and buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake with silent, wrenching sobs. I did the only thing I could think to do. I sat down beside him, not touching him, but closing the distance until our shoulders were almost brushing. I let him cry. I didn't offer empty reassurances or ask for details. I just sat there and shared the silence with him, offering my quiet presence as a bulwark against the storm that was raging inside him. It was a familiar role for me, the silent observer, the steady presence. But this time, it felt different. The air was charged with a new kind of vulnerability. He wasn't just my friend seeking comfort. He was a man completely adrift, and he had steered his boat to my shore, the only one he trusted not to break him further on the rocks. After a long time, his sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. "She said I was a ghost," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "She said I was there, but not really. That I never let her in. Not all the way." He looked up at me then, and his eyes were raw with a pain that was older and deeper than just this breakup. "She was right, Leo. I don't know how. I don't know how to let anyone in." The confession hung in the air between us, painfully honest. It was the first crack in the carefully constructed facade of the effortlessly charming Alex I had known for years. He was admitting to the very thing I had only ever suspected, that for all his outward sociability, he was profoundly lonely. He was surrounded by people, but he was fundamentally alone. The irony was a bitter pill. Here he was, confessing his inability to let anyone in, while I was sitting beside him, a person who had spent the better part of a decade desperately wishing he would open that door for me. "You should get some sleep," I said softly, steering us back to safer, more practical ground. "You can take my bed." "I'll take the couch." He shook his head, a quick, dismissive gesture. No, I couldn't. "The couch is fine. I can't be alone tonight." And so the new dynamic began. He stayed on the couch. I brought him a pillow and my warmest blanket, the heavy woolen one my grandmother had made. I went to my room, but I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person breathing in my apartment. The walls, which had always felt like the boundaries of my safe, ordered world, now felt porous, permeable. His grief, his loneliness, was seeping through them, filling my space, and I found that I didn't mind. I was just glad he was here, where I could keep an eye on him, where he wasn't alone with the ghosts of his failed relationship. I fell asleep long after the sun had risen, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of his breath. That first night established the new ritual. Alex didn't go back to his apartment for 3 days. He worked remotely from my kitchen table, a phantom in his own life, dialing into conference calls with a voice that sounded hollow and distant. In the evenings, we fell into a quiet routine. We'd order takeout, watch old movies we both knew by heart, and talk in circles around the thing that was really broken. We talked about work, about mutual friends, about anything and everything except the gaping hole Sarah's departure had left in his life. It was a delicate dance of avoidance, and I let him lead. Each night, he would retreat to the couch, and I would retreat to my room, the 10 feet of hallway between us feeling like a mile-wide chasm. I became hyper-aware of him, of his presence in my carefully curated space. I knew the sound of his footsteps on my hardwood floors, the specific way he sighed when he was frustrated with a line of code, the smell of his soap mingling with the coffee I brewed each morning. My apartment, once solely mine, was now a shared territory. His laptop was on the kitchen table, his jacket was slung over a chair, his shoes were by the door. These small invasions of his life into mine were both thrilling and terrifying. They were physical evidence of his need for me, a need that was becoming increasingly central to his life, and therefore, to mine. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the joy of having him so close and the constant, gnawing anxiety that it was all temporary. I was a stopgap, a temporary shelter in the storm. And storms, by their very nature, eventually pass. On the 4th night, something shifted again. We were watching a documentary about deep-sea exploration, the screen casting flickering blue light across the dark room. Alex had been quiet all evening, a heavy, contemplative silence wrapped around him like a shroud. I glanced over at him. He wasn't watching the screen. He was staring at his hands, turning them over and over as if seeing them for the first time. The narrator on the television was talking about the immense pressure in the deep ocean, how it could crush a submarine as if it were a tin can. I felt a pang of empathy. Alex looked like he was experiencing that same crushing pressure, not from water, but from the sheer weight of his own life. When the documentary ended, the credits rolling in silence, he didn't move. He just sat there, a silhouette against the pale glow of the television. "I had another nightmare last night," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't look at me. About the dark. About being alone in it. My heart ached for him. "Do you want to talk about it?" He shook his head. "There's nothing to say. It's just empty." He finally turned to look at me, and in the dim light, his eyes were wide and vulnerable, stripped of all their usual defenses. "Leo," he said, his voice hesitant. "This is going to sound stupid, but would you mind if I just slept on the floor in your room? I know it's weird. It's just, the living room feels so big tonight. So empty, my breath hitched." This was a new development, a significant escalation in our unspoken negotiation of boundaries. The couch was one thing. It was public space, a neutral zone. My bedroom was another thing entirely. It was my inner sanctum, the most private part of my world. To let him in was to let him past a barrier I had never lowered for anyone. But looking at his face, at the genuine, desperate plea in his eyes, I knew I couldn't say no. Refusing him would feel like a cruelty, like turning away a refugee seeking sanctuary. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Yeah, that's okay." He looked so relieved it was like watching a physical weight lift from his shoulders. I retrieved the spare comforter and a pillow from the hall closet, my hands trembling slightly. I laid them out on the floor beside my bed, creating a makeshift pallet. The act felt strangely domestic, intensely intimate. He followed me into the room and sat down on the bedding, looking up at me with a gratitude that made my chest feel tight. "Thanks, Leo," he said softly. "Really, it's fine," I managed to say. "Get some sleep." I got into my own bed, my body thrumming with a nervous energy that was part anxiety, part exhilaration. I turned off the light, plunging the room into a darkness that was now shared. It was a different kind of darkness than before. It was alive, filled with the presence of another person, with the sound of his breathing, the rustle of the comforter as he settled in. I lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling, my senses stretched to their absolute limit. I could feel his presence in the room like a change in barometric pressure. He was only a few feet away, but he might as well have been lying next to me for all the effect he was having on my equilibrium. This became the new ritual. For the next week, Alex slept on my floor. He never mentioned the nightmares again, and I never asked. The pretext had been offered and accepted, and now it hung in the air between us, a convenient fiction that allowed us both to pretend this was a normal, logical arrangement. It was anything but. Every night, I would lie in my bed, acutely aware of him sleeping just below me. I would listen to the rhythm of his breathing, sometimes deep and even, sometimes shallow and troubled. I would fight the overwhelming urge to reach down, to touch his hair, to offer a comfort that went beyond just sharing a room. I was walking a tightrope over a canyon of my own longing, and the fear of falling was constant. The arrangement was a peculiar kind of torture. Having him so close was a dream I had barely allowed myself to entertain, but the reality of it was fraught with the tension of what was unsaid, untouched. I felt like a photographer in a darkroom, watching an image slowly emerge in the chemical bath. I could see the outlines of something new and beautiful taking shape between us, but I was terrified that any sudden movement, any exposure to the harsh light of a direct question, would ruin it completely, leaving me with nothing but a blank, overexposed sheet of paper. So I held my breath and waited in the dark, hoping the image would resolve on its own. I started to notice the little things, the subtle shifts in his behavior. He started initiating small, casual touches. A hand on my shoulder as he passed behind me in the kitchen, his foot brushing against mine under the table. Each touch was a spark that sent a jolt through my entire system. They were small enough to be deniable, easily dismissed as accidental, but they were happening with increasing frequency. I cataloged each one, replaying them in my mind, trying to decipher their meaning. Was he becoming more comfortable with me, or was this something else? Was he unconsciously reaching for a connection he couldn't name, or was I just projecting my own desperate hope onto his innocent gestures? The ambiguity was maddening. One evening, about 2 weeks into this new living arrangement, we were on the couch, side by side. watching some mindless action movie. He had been quiet all day, lost in his own thoughts. As the movie progressed, I felt him lean slightly, his shoulder pressing against mine. I froze, my body going rigid. He didn't pull away. He just stayed there, the warmth of his body a solid, reassuring pressure against my side. After a few minutes, his head drooped, and I felt the soft weight of it come to rest on my shoulder. He had fallen asleep. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sat there, perfectly still, for the entire rest of the movie, my arm going numb beneath his weight. I studied his face in the flickering light from the screen. His features, usually so animated, were soft and peaceful in sleep. A stray lock of hair had fallen across his forehead, and I had to physically restrain my hand from reaching up and brushing it away. This was a new level of intimacy, a new boundary crossed without a word. He was trusting me in his sleep, in his most vulnerable state. The feeling that washed over me was a potent, dangerous cocktail of tenderness and terror. I wanted this. I wanted this more than I had ever wanted anything. But I was so afraid of what it meant, of where it was leading. When the movie ended, I didn't have the heart to wake him. I gently shifted, trying to ease out from under him, but he stirred, murmuring something incoherent. Instead of pulling away, he shifted closer, his arm draping across my lap, and settled back into a deep sleep. I was trapped, pinned by the weight of his unconscious affection. So I stayed. I sat there for another hour, the credits long since finished, the screensaver a swirling pattern of abstract colors. I just sat and watched him breathe, my own personal guardian of his sleep. It was the most peaceful and the most agonizing hour of my life. Eventually, I knew I had to move. I carefully extricated myself, lifting his head and gently lowering it onto a cushion. He barely stirred. I stood up and looked down at him, a mess of conflicting emotions churning inside me. This couldn't continue. This limbo was unsustainable. Something had to give. I went to my room, leaving the door open a few inches, a habit I'd developed since he started sleeping on the floor. It was a silent invitation, a signal that he wasn't alone. I got into bed, my mind a tangled mess of hope and fear. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that tonight would be different. The delicate equilibrium we had established was about to shatter. Which brings us back to the moment it all changed. To the sound of my door whispering open, the dip of the mattress, the heat of his body next to mine. He lay with his back to me for what felt like an eternity. I was holding my breath, waiting. For what? I didn't know. An explanation? An apology? A confession? The silence stretched, thin and taut, on the verge of snapping. I was acutely aware of every detail of the room. The way the moonlight cut a silver slash across the floor, the faint scent of his shampoo on the pillow, the almost imperceptible tremor in my own hands. Then he shifted. He rolled over slowly, deliberately, to face me. In the dim light, I could just make out the shape of him, the dark pools of his eyes fixed on mine. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. This was it, the moment of truth. The air crackled with everything we had never said, with years of my secret affection and weeks of his unspoken need. He was so close I could feel the warmth of his breath on my face. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, his gaze intense, searching. It felt like he was seeing me for the first time, not as Leo the friend, the reliable anchor, but as someone else entirely. And in his eyes, I saw a reflection of my own yearning, my own fear. He was just as lost in this as I was. He was the unknowing initiator, the one who had set all of this in motion without a map, and now he had arrived at a destination he didn't recognize, and he was looking to me for directions. Slowly, as if moving through water, he lifted a hand and gently, tentatively, touched my face. His fingers were warm against my cheek, his touch feather-light, hesitant. It was a question, not a statement. It was a plea for permission. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I leaned into his touch, just a fraction of an inch, a silent answer to his silent question. A small, shuddering breath escaped him, a sound of relief. His thumb stroked my cheekbone, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a wildfire racing through my veins. The space between us, once a chasm, had shrunk to nothing. We were in a new territory now, a place without names or rules, and we were the only two inhabitants. The rest of the world, with its expectations and its neat little boxes, had ceased to exist. There was only this room, this bed, this silence. He moved closer, the warmth of his body now a solid wall against mine. His other hand came to rest on my waist, a grounding touch that was both possessive and deeply reassuring. I could feel the steady beat of his heart through his shirt, or maybe it was my own. They were hammering in unison, a frantic, shared rhythm. He searched my eyes one last time, and I held his gaze, trying to pour all of my unspoken feelings, all of my years of quiet waiting, into that one look. I tried to tell him, without words, that it was okay, that I was here, that whatever this was, he wasn't in it alone. Then he spoke. His voice was a raw whisper, rough with sleep and vulnerability, and it shattered the last of the silence. Leo, my own voice was barely audible, a knot of emotion tightening my throat. Yeah. He paused, and in that pause, I felt the entire history of our friendship and the terrifying, beautiful potential of our future. It was the longest second of my life. Is it okay if I kiss you? The question, so direct, so vulnerable, was like a key turning in a lock deep inside me. All the fear, all the anxiety, all the years of carefully guarded hope came rushing out. There was no room for analysis anymore, no space for doubt. There was only this boy, this man, my Alex, asking for permission to cross the final threshold. And there was only one possible answer. I didn't trust myself to speak. I just nodded, a small, jerky movement in the dark. That was all the confirmation he needed. He leaned in, closing the final inch between us, and his lips met mine. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of profound, breathtaking tenderness. It was hesitant, soft, a question asked and answered in the same moment. It tasted of sleep and sadness and a desperate, dawning hope. It was a confession, a surrender, an arrival. In that one, simple, impossibly complex kiss, the world tilted on its axis. The before was over, and the after, terrifying and unknown as it was, had finally begun. The aftermath of a storm is a strange and silent thing. The world is washed clean, but the landscape is irrevocably altered. Trees are uprooted, familiar paths are erased. That's what the morning felt like. When I woke up, the first thing I was aware of was the warmth of a body curled against mine. Alex was still there, his arm thrown over my waist, his face buried in the crook of my neck. For a few blissful, hazy seconds, I allowed myself to believe that this was real, that this was our new reality. The memory of the kiss, of the whispered conversation that followed, a fragmented, desperate series of I don't know what this is, and it's okay, felt like a dream. But the solid weight of him against me was undeniable proof. Then I felt him stir. He tensed, his breathing changing as he woke up. And with his consciousness, the comfortable warmth in the bed began to evaporate, replaced by a sudden, chilling awkwardness. He pulled away from me slowly, as if realizing for the first time where he was, who he was with. He sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair, and he wouldn't look at me. The silence that filled the room was a different kind than the night before. It was not thick with unspoken yearning. It was thin and brittle with regret and confusion. I should go, he mumbled, his voice gravelly. He didn't look at me. He was already swinging his legs over the side of the bed, his back a rigid wall between us. Alex, wait, I started, but he was already on his feet, pulling on the shirt he'd discarded on the floor. I'm late for a call, he said, the excuse so flimsy, so obviously false, that it was more insulting than silence. I'll grab my stuff from the living room. Thanks for, he was gone before I could say another word. I heard him gathering his things, the clatter of his laptop, the zip of his bag, and then the soft click of the front door closing. And then there was only silence. A deep, profound, crushing silence that was 1,000 times worse than the quiet of my apartment before he had filled it. I lay there, in the wreckage of our shared bed, the sheets still holding the faint warmth of his body, and I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss hadn't been an arrival. It had been a moment of weakness, a desperate act of comfort-seeking that he now regretted in the harsh light of day. I wasn't his harbor. I was just a convenient port in a storm, and now that the sun was out, he had set sail without a backward glance. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the dark had withered into a sharp, bitter agony. I had let him in, not just into my bed, but into that secret, locked room inside myself. And he had walked out and left the door swinging wide open, leaving me exposed and shivering in the draft. The next 3 days were a masterclass in a special kind of hell. My apartment, which had so recently felt like a shared sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Every object was a reminder of him. The coffee mug he'd used, the blanket on the couch, the indent his head had left on the pillow next to mine. I replayed our last conversation, the kiss, every moment of the preceding weeks, over and over in my mind, searching for the clue I had missed, the warning sign I had ignored. Had I been so blinded by my own hope that I had constructed a reality that didn't exist? The thought was humiliating, a deep, internal shame that burned behind my eyes. My phone remained silent. I checked it obsessively, my stomach twisting into a tighter knot with every passing hour that brought no text, no call. He had simply vanished, erased himself from my life as easily as deleting a file. The silence from him was a definitive statement. It said, "That was a mistake. Let's pretend it never happened." And the most painful part was that pretending it never happened would also mean pretending our friendship had never been as deep as I believed it to be. Because a real friend, wouldn't do this. A real friend wouldn't take your most vulnerable offering and then disappear without a word. By the fourth day, the grief and humiliation had begun to curdle into a slow-burning anger. An anger at him for his cowardice, but also an anger at myself for being so passive, for letting him dictate the entire emotional landscape of our relationship. I had been the observer for too long, waiting in the dark for the image to develop. It was time to turn on the lights, even if it meant ruining the picture forever. I couldn't live in this limbo anymore. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I needed a final, definitive answer. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over his contact photo, a picture I had taken years ago of him laughing, carefree, on the beach. My hand was shaking, but my resolve was firm. I wasn't going to text. A text was too easy to ignore, too easy to misinterpret. I pressed the call button. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I was about to hang up, my courage failing, when he answered. "Hello." His voice was guarded, hesitant. "It's me," I said, my own voice sounding foreign and strained to my ears. "We need to talk, Alex." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of traffic, the white noise of his life continuing on without me. "Leo, I don't think that's a good idea. No, we're not doing this," I said, the anger finally breaking through the surface. "You don't get to do what you did and then just disappear. You don't get to turn my entire world upside down and then pretend you don't know me. That's not fair." I was breathing heavily, my heart pounding. "I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm not asking for a relationship or a promise or anything. But I am demanding an explanation. You owe me that much. You owe our friendship that much." The silence on his end was so complete, I thought he might have hung up. Then, I heard him take a deep, shuddering breath. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice thick with a resignation that sounded like defeat. "I'm at my apartment. Don't move," he said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The 20 minutes I waited for him to arrive were the longest of my life. I paced my living room, a caged animal of anxiety. What would I say? What would he say? I had no script, no plan. I just knew that the silence had to be broken. When the doorbell finally rang, the sound jolted through me like an electric shock. I took a deep breath and opened the door. He looked even worse than he had the night of his breakup. He was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He walked past me into the apartment without a word and stood in the same spot he had stood that first night, in the center of the room, looking lost. "Say what you need to say, Leo," he said, his voice flat. his gaze fixed on some distant point over my shoulder. I closed the door and turned to face him, my anger and my hurt warring with the overwhelming urge to go to him, to comfort him. "I just want to know why, Alex," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Why did you run? What are you so afraid of?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a torment that stunned me into silence. "Myself," he whispered. "I'm afraid of myself." He sank onto the couch, the same couch where this had all started, and buried his face in his hands, a haunting echo of that first night. But this time, I didn't sit beside him. I remained standing, a prosecutor in my own living room, waiting for the testimony. "I don't understand," I said. He looked up, his face a mask of self-loathing. "Of course you don't. How could you? I don't even understand." He took a ragged breath. "All my life, I've had this path. You know? The athlete, the good student, the successful consultant, the guy with the pretty girlfriend. It was all laid out, a straight line. And I walked it. Because it was easy. Because it was what everyone expected." He gestured vaguely around the room. "And then there was you. You were the one person who didn't fit on that line. You were different. You were quiet, and you saw things. You saw me, the real me. Not the swimmer, not the consultant. Just me. And being with you, it was the only time I ever felt like I could just breathe. Like I didn't have to perform." He stood up and began to pace, his agitation growing. "When Sarah left, she said I was a ghost. And she was right. Because I was haunting my own life. I was going through the motions, but I wasn't there. The only place I felt real, the only place I felt solid, was here. With you." He stopped in front of me, his eyes pleading for me to understand. "That night, when I came into your room, I wasn't thinking. I was just moving. I was so tired of being alone in my own head, and your room felt like the only safe place in the world. And when I kissed you, for that 1 second, everything made sense. It was like coming home. It was the realest thing I've felt in my entire life." "Then why did you run?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Because it terrified me," he exclaimed, his voice rising with a frantic energy. "That feeling, it didn't fit on my line. It blew up the whole damn map. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, it all just shattered. And I looked at it, and I looked at you, and I was so scared. Scared of what it meant. Scared of hurting you. Scared of what people would think. Scared that I was so broken that I was just using you, the one good thing in my life, to make myself feel better." His confession poured out of him, a torrent of fear and confusion and a deep, profound self-doubt. And as I listened, my anger began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of aching empathy. He hadn't run from me. He had run from himself. He had run from a truth so powerful it threatened to undo the entire architecture of his life. He wasn't a coward. He was just a man who had been handed the wrong map at birth and had only just realized he was completely and utterly lost. I closed the distance between us, and, for the first time, I was the one who initiated the touch. I placed my hands on his shoulders, forcing him to be still, to look at me. "Alex," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "Look at me. You're not broken. And you weren't using me. You were just finding your way home in the dark. It's okay to be lost. It's okay to be scared. But you don't have to do it alone anymore." Tears welled in his eyes, and this time, he didn't hide them. They spilled over, tracking paths down his tired face. "I'm so sorry, Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed grief. "I'm so sorry I hurt you. I was just so scared." "I know," I said. And I did. I finally understood. All his life, he had been swimming in lanes defined by others. And for the first time, he had found himself in open water, with no black line on the bottom of the pool to guide him. Of course he was terrified. He leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against mine. We stood there for a long time, in the center of my living room, just breathing together, two lost ships finding their mooring in each other. The storm had passed. The wreckage was all around us, but we were both still standing. And for the first time in days, the silence in the room was not empty. It was filled with the quiet, tentative promise of rebuilding. The conversation that followed was long and difficult, but it was honest. We sat on the couch, side by side, but this time there was no pretense, no movie to hide behind. We talked for hours, dismantling the edifice of our old friendship and examining the pieces, trying to figure out how to build something new from the rubble. He told me about the crushing weight of expectation he'd carried his whole life, the feeling of being an actor playing a part he'd never auditioned for. I, in turn, told him about the years of my quiet, unspoken affection, the world I had built around him in my head and through my camera lens. It was a conversation of mutual confession, of laying down our weapons and showing each other our scars. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. It was too soon for that, too fragile. We didn't even have a name for what we were becoming. All we had was a shared understanding, a mutual agreement to be brave enough to figure it out together. We agreed to take it slow, to navigate this new, uncharted territory one step at a time. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer a terrifying solo. It was a harmony, a duet we could face together. That night, when we finally fell silent, exhausted from the emotional excavation, a new question hung in the air. Where would he sleep? The couch felt like a retreat, a step backward. My bed felt like a leap forward we might not be ready for. It was Alex who made the decision. He stood up, took my hand, and simply said, "Come on." He led me to my bedroom. He didn't get on the floor, and he didn't slide in under the covers as if by accident. He pulled back the comforter, a clear, deliberate invitation, and waited for me. We got into bed together, face to face, and for the first time, there was no ambiguity. There was no plausible deniability. This was a choice, a conscious, intentional act of togetherness. He reached for my hand under the covers, his fingers lacing with mine. "No more running," he whispered in the dark. "No more running," I whispered back. And we slept. It was the deepest, most peaceful sleep I had had in years. The days that followed were a study in quiet reclamation. We began to build a new normal, a new language spoken in small gestures and shared spaces. Alex didn't move in, but he rarely stayed at his own apartment. My space became our space. His toothbrush appeared in the holder next to mine. A few of his shirts found their way into my closet. These small domestic incursions were no longer a source of anxiety, but a quiet, comforting confirmation of his intention to stay. We learned to exist together in the quiet. We could spend an entire evening in the same room without speaking, me editing photos, him working on his laptop, the comfortable silence a testament to our newfound security. The frantic need to analyze every gesture, every word, was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding sense of peace. I had spent so long observing him from a distance, and now, I was finally learning the texture of his presence up close. I learned that he hummed when he was concentrating, that he made the best coffee but always left a mess, that he was terrified of thunderstorms, a holdover from a childhood memory he couldn't quite place. And he, in turn, learned me. He learned to read my moods in the set of my shoulders, to respect my need for solitude, to see the stories in my photographs that I couldn't always articulate with words. One Saturday afternoon, I was in my darkroom, the red safe light casting an ethereal glow over everything. I was developing a new series of portraits, and I was completely absorbed in the process. The door creaked open, and Alex slipped inside, closing it softly behind him. He didn't speak, knowing not to interrupt the delicate process. He just came and stood behind me, his hands resting lightly on my waist, his chin on my shoulder. We stood like that for a long time, watching as a face slowly emerged from the blank paper submerged in the developer. "I love watching you do this," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "It's like magic. You take something invisible and you make it real." I turned my head, my cheek brushing against his. "That's what you did for me," I said softly. He didn't need to ask what I meant. He just tightened his hold, a silent acknowledgement of the truth in my words. For years, my love for him had been an invisible thing, a latent image hidden in the darkness of my own heart. And he, with his clumsy, terrified, beautiful honesty, had finally brought it into the light. A few weeks later, he had to go on his first work trip since everything had changed between us. The night before he left, a familiar anxiety began to creep back in. The thought of him being gone, of the apartment being empty again, was a stark reminder of how things used to be. He must have sensed my unease. As he was packing his suitcase, he stopped, walked over to his keys, and took one off the ring. He came over to me and pressed it into my palm, closing my fingers around it. "This is for my place," he said, his eyes holding mine. "So you know I'm coming back. So you know there's always a door for you, too." The small, cold piece of metal in my hand felt heavier than a promise, more solid than a vow. It was a tangible piece of our new foundation. It was trust. It was an invitation. It was a key to a future I had long ago stopped letting myself dream of. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The empty spaces in his life, and the locked rooms in mine, were slowly being filled, not with noise or distraction, but with the profound, steady comfort of a shared presence. We found that the thresholds that had once seemed so terrifying were simply doorways to a larger, brighter room. And the home we were building was not made of walls and a roof, but of mutual vulnerability, of quiet understanding, and of the simple, revolutionary courage to close the door on the rest of the world and choose, every single night, to stay.